Hi, folks. Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Amelia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're so glad you could join us to share a little bit about WholeTrees. And I am wondering if you could start by sharing with our listeners, what is WholeTrees and how did you get into this work? What's your story?
Well, WholeTrees is a company that's scaling the use of low-value trees in commercial construction. These are trees that are marked for removal from well-managed forest stands nationally and that have no or very little market value. We're bringing these trees into new commercial construction markets by better understanding their engineered properties, their strength, and their capacity to hold up weight similar to steel. So that's the big picture story. We sell products, columns, beams, and long-spanning trusses, as well as pre-engineered custom structures, but we also innovate the software platform that connects inventories to architects and interior designers, as well as the grading systems required in the manufacturing process to properly assign design values to round timber. And then I think what we do best is tell a story of building products and how they come from an agricultural or ecosystem and how they arrive on site, that there really is a story for every product in a building and that we get to play with that story by really showing off the form of a tree in structure. It can be very stunning, very awe-inspiring in a building. So how did I get here? I studied environmental studies in college, and I combined an interest in the values that shape the way we treat our natural resources. I was very interested in agriculture and sustainable agriculture. And then the values, I studied religion. I was really interested in comparative religion and what it said about our relationship to our ecosystem, and also the values that are created by markets and economics. So this full circle running from the role religion and economics plays in the way that we deal with our natural resources. So that's what I was impassioned by in college. That's when I learned about equal exchange coffee and the fair trade coffee movement. That's the first time I learned that if you envisioned a shift in a business model on a grand scale, you could make real impacts in people's lives and those people who are working the land and owning land and changing the ways that they manage their lands. In that case, coffee fields and coffee labor practices, et cetera. So I think that the seeds planted by the fair trade movement had stuck with me as I went through my early career. At some point, I met my co-founder, Roald Gunderson, who had been building with cull trees, or the trees being removed from managed forest, in really beautiful, structural, sensual ways that I thought were quite on trend for Gen Xers. And we founded WholeTrees because we felt like the green building movement was intersecting with Gen Xers at the time and now millennials, who have a little bit more of a drive to solve climate issues and take bigger risks and make bigger statements with their profession. And it turns out we've been right, and WholeTrees has been able to inspire Gen Xers and millennials in different building professions nationally. So it's a really exciting time to be doing what we're doing.
Thank you for that. And you've used the word beautiful now a couple of times. And for those listeners that may be driving or not seeing the imagery of these really striking literal trees incorporated into the building environment, you've had high profile installs such as the Cleveland Zoo, I believe. Could you just bring our listeners into kind of a moment or a story or a favorite example of how it actually looks on the ground?
Sure. When you see our product, you're seeing trees that have not been machined in any way. So they haven't had their edges cut off. They haven't been turned into squares. And a lot of time the undulations, the burls, the non-structural branching offshoots are still seen in the column structure. Or you're seeing long spanning beams and trusses above you holding up ceilings. But the beams have not been lathed. They haven't had all of their natural form shaved off of them. And so there's, when you run your eyes along the material, you're seeing the structure holding up a building, but you're also seeing the shape that Mother Nature gave this material. And that can be a very soothing and awe-inspiring thing to rest your eyes on in our very urban machined environment. A story would, let's see, one of our favorites is the grocery store structural system that we did here in Madison, Wisconsin for Festival Foods grocery store. They wanted to source ash trees from the Parks District here in Madison, Wisconsin. The ash tree nationally has been infected with the emerald ash borer, which is killing pretty much 100% of our ash trees. Millions and millions of ash trees are being lost nationally. It's sad. However, they do not lose their structural capacity for about 2 years after being infected. So we worked with the Parks Department to bring enormous 27-foot ash tree sections from the parks to our fabrication yard. And we fabricated them with enormous steel base connections and steel top connections. We graded them so that they met our engineers' requirements, and then they were delivered to the grocery store and connected to our long-spanning trusses, so that what you see are these very enormous, character-filled ash trees interspersed throughout the vegetable aisle and the meat department and the cereal aisle, and they're kind of like presence. They have a presence. They have like a spirit throughout the grocery store. And they moved pretty much 3 miles from the park where they were harvested to the fabrication yard and back into the building, which is a very local story in terms of building products. Wow.
I hope everyone will go home and take a gander on the internet and see that. Those images are really beautiful of that Festival Foods. And I really appreciate the sensitivity around the embodied carbon in the building envelope and what you mentioned around the 3 mile distance traveled. Could you talk a little bit about just the industry standard of concrete and steel? And you've even said that these wood trusses are cheaper to produce than steel or concrete. Talk to us a little bit about what is the industry right now and what is the potential for your solution to be replacing?
Great. So in general, construction internationally contributes to more than a third of our global carbon and pollution emissions. It's a major force in driving climate issues as well as other pollution issues. And so the building profession now sees itself as a solution by learning to specify products that have lower embodied energy. That phrase means that it takes less fuel to extract a raw material, export and move that raw material, turn that raw material into a structural product or another, or a brick or a wall panel, and then get it into a project. So the term low embodied energy also generally implies low carbon emissions, because of course fuel, the movement of materials from one place to another, and the processing of materials requires a great deal of carbon creating fuels. There's a drive to do something called net zero construction, which takes into the fact that if we can build buildings that are producing their own energy, that are processing their own water on site, and that are using materials with low embodied energy, that we can solve some of these issues in construction right now. For steel and concrete as structure, so that was all a preface, of course, and for steel and concrete as structure, both of those materials produce a great deal of carbon in their material extraction and shipping to bring them to job sites and the processing of the material. On the other hand, timber uses far less carbon as you remove trees from a healthily managed, sustainably managed tree stand or forest stand. And then the trees themselves, when put into building products, actually sequester carbon or hold carbon in their structure rather than releasing the carbon that they would if they were to burn in a wildfire or if they were to break down on the forest floor. So carbon sequestering materials are becoming quite exciting in the architectural and the building communities, that we could build bigger and bigger, taller buildings, larger developments out of carbon sequestering materials. So round timber, you don't have to mill it, you don't have to slice it up, you don't have to chip it up and glue it back together for a laminated product. Round timber has the lowest embodied energy of any structural material in the United States. And it also has the capacity to encourage sustainable management of the forests from which we harvest our WholeTrees. And as forests are sustainably managed, they actually increase their carbon uptake. They become carbon sequestering entities. So healthily managed forests actually improve our environment. And by removing young trees, lower value trees, trees that help other trees in the stand grow to be larger, we're actually improving our carbon sequestration in that end as well. That was a long arc of a sentence.
It's amazing. I mean, talk about such a blended stack of functions in this one business idea that you and your business partner have brought into being, probably through standing on many, many people's shoulders of brilliant thinkers. But we talk a lot about this actually with the entrepreneurs we work with about the idea of embedding the mission of your organization or entity into a product that consumers are already habituated to purchasing on the market. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit, like, how did you come to the realization that this was an opportunity in the industry, that people would actually kind of go away from the cultural norms of concrete and steel and actually, put their money down on buying a structural form like this?
Yeah, we were young and passionate, and we didn't understand some of the market forces we do now. And luckily, some of the market turned out to be right with our instincts. But to be honest, we found it 12 years ago, and we had a lot of mission and a little bit maybe less understanding about how our product would replace existing products or the reality of that. So we had a lot of mission. The mission was, here we have this low value agricultural product and there's a market for it, and people's mindsets are changing and they are becoming more mission oriented, and we can sell this. So that's how we started. And I think we made a lot of decisions early on. I'm proud of them, but they were very mission based as opposed to how can we grow this business model. And over the years, I think we actually laced the business model into the mission as opposed to making sure we continued lacing the mission into the business model. Maybe I would do it a little differently now. Luckily, we stayed afloat because we were smart, kept an eye on opportunity, and because our market wants mission. They want something authentic. And so now that we've kind of got them both balanced, we have a strong business model that's proving itself, and we're able to tout the mission of prosperity with forests and a regenerative building product for our industry. We're able to bring that mission and use it towards our business model. So it works for us now. And now that we are sort of situated in a strong position, we've committed to being a B corporation. We think the B Corp movement is incredibly important internationally. And we internally keep making sure that our team understands our mission. Are we bringing our sustainability mandates to our inventory supply chains? Are we making sure that we communicate in a leadership fomenting way? Do we make sure we foment leadership from within as opposed to squash it? How is our level of transparency as a company and how we run ourselves? All of these things are laced into us now.
I think it would be interesting for our listeners to hear some of those innovations you've made in the business model. You've done really interesting online platform for engineers and architects to be able to visualize how your materials can fit into their designs. Maybe talk about some of those like moments of inflection where you're like, oh, this is needed to make our business viable.
Oh, that's a great point. Yes, that's probably the way one continues to be able to lace mission into business models, by having moments of inflection and being willing to pivot. We have been funded by federal grants to enable an innovation department. So while we sell product to architects and general contractors and to buildings, we are always getting to see, gosh, if only this or this or this innovation existed, that process would go so much smoother. And as we learned from selling, we had grant dollars to actually build up ideas and concepts. So it became clear that modern day architects really need to have a digital toolkit if they're going to design with something. And so we wrote grants to develop a software platform with the idea that it would actually build our market and build our business. If we had the platform that translated this low value agricultural product into a building material, then we would sell more trees into buildings. So it had to do with this constant ongoing discussion of making sure we're selling product and making our clients happier and happier each year, while at the same time reflecting and writing grants behind the scenes on, well, how could we do this at scale and how can we grow bigger and faster? What technologies, what innovations are required? It was a back and forth. And for those listeners that want to combine mission with a business model, grants are a really smart thing to do in your early years, but never lose sight of the role the grants will play in building your own business model.
Beautifully said. Such great advice. I cannot underscore that enough. That's a very, very important lesson learned.
Yeah, we wrote, to be clear, we've done grants and we've done innovation that really did not need to be done to grow our business. There were times when we wrote grants because we were really excited about what we got to do with the grant. And over time, as mind takes over in order to survive and feed a larger and larger payroll each month, one starts to have to say, all right, that sounds really cool to do, but we don't need to do that for another 10 years. And so we're not going to. And so saying no became more and more of a part of our mission, that you can be an idealist and have this big heart and this big excitement, but that needs to have the capacity to say no embedded within it in a way that is loving and compassionate.
Love that. You brought up culture, and I'm curious if you could expand a little more on that. Maybe give our listeners a bit of perspective on the growth of your company and how you've maintained, or what are some learnings around culture and building the team that you've learned along the way?
Oh, that's a great, as you probably know, it's such a big buzzword right now. And you're finding that with many of your interviews, I suppose?
Well, I guess in addition to the fact that it's a buzzword, we're also finding that it is one of those things that, at least on the ground, it's something that can so easily be forgotten or overlooked when people are trying to, make ends meet, balance the balance sheet, and all of that. So that's why I ask is to kind of make it visible, the work and effort behind maintaining and growing a thriving culture, as opposed to just letting it inevitably happen.
Yeah, no, I think when I said buzzword, maybe it sounded a little bit like I was trying to slough it off, but the truth is it's an on-trend buzzword in business, and it is incredibly real too. So I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah.
I think there's two sides to that question. One is innovative, mission-minded companies tend to have a fun culture. I mean, because they're coming from a place of the heart as well as a place of necessity. And that can attract great staff. And throughout our whole 12 years, we have attracted some incredible people who are drawn to the mission. So one thing is, of course, lead with mission. Don't be ashamed of it. It will attract some great minds and some great staff. And then as you grow, how do you maintain that? I do think that comes from the inner, this is going to sound maybe a little soft, or maybe your listeners will like it, but I think the inner work of the leaders is huge. If a leader is stagnant within themselves, and if there are emotional blocks inside the leaders of the department, or especially the CEO, then there will be blind spots that feed down into all the departments. And there will be places that department heads and department employees feel like they aren't able to get what they need because of these blind spots. A good example would be the toxicity that some people bring to being confronted by others. If there isn't an open dialogue from the top down or a willingness to be firm, but also hear differing views, then that leads down to the next set of leaders in an organization who then feel that they may have to hold back on certain areas because they know they'll get the toxicity fed to them. And I've watched that in our organization at times when we've had toxicity in our staff. And so having the ongoing reflection as a leader internally, where am I not growing? And that helps me see where others in my staff aren't growing. And if there are staff members who can't keep growing and looking internally in order to offer their best selves to those they work above and below, then sometimes they need to be given mandates or to be removed. And that's something I think that's really important to culture, recognizing that our internal growth as individuals is a valid, real thing that needs to be talked about. And if there are people who find that off-putting, we've found that our culture at WholeTrees actually, in the end, those people choose to leave. And it's really hard when people choose to leave. I go through a whole inner reflect. You might feel bad about yourself when people choose to leave, but I have come to believe that if you put your culture out there and you live yourself, your true self, that those who leave were meant to leave. And so culture is about committing to your mission, but then also committing to the inner work required as a leader.
And I love that you use culture as a verb there, the act of actually culturing the community feel and values, and just appreciating the acknowledgement of an internal, maybe even go so far as to call it a grieving process when someone does leave, but that's just as important as celebrating the people who are staying with.
That's well said. It is, yeah, well said. It is. It's culture is like yogurt or compost. We use that here because we come from agricultural backgrounds. Inoculating the culture, inoculating the institution with culture. It's a very rich, moist activity like composting or making yogurt.
Absolutely. So I'm curious if you could articulate for our listeners, what is the vision, maybe even a 5 or 10 or however far out you want to go, of how you see WholeTrees growing and becoming even more of a player than it already is in the forestry movement and in the built environment?
Great question. Even 12 years ago, our vision was to scale a low or no value byproduct of healthy forestry into construction so that someday we'd see parking garages and skyscrapers made of unmilled trees. So that's always been there, this big pie in the sky horizon that we're working towards. So we're using supply to market software. We're using manufacturing processes that can be licensed. And we're using our first to market brand to scale the material and bring unmilled timber products to compete with steel in price. So in 5 to 10 years' time, we want to see our truss systems costing the same as steel truss systems, which will then really turn the market towards a new method of carbon sequestering low embodied construction. We really do have to bring all our prices down to meet or beat that of steel. That's the vision. And so we will be licensing our production process to other timber fabricators by 2021. We'll be using our sales and inventory software platform to collect data on regional forests, what is marked for removal, and then opening up those inventories of standing trees to architects and engineers. And we'll be seeing the capacity of more fabricators able to produce these high quality, well-graded structural systems made of unmilled trees. I should add that we also hope this happens internationally to inspire other forested countries to begin building in ways that are regenerative.
Right. Because I imagine you're probably tracking that trend towards concrete and steel is already happening, even in countries that may have a really deep history of building with natural, more unprocessed materials. That's a really important point. I appreciate you bringing that up. So I am eager to join that journey with you. And one question that is coming up for me is how the fires, especially across the country, but in California, we've seen and witnessed them. How could you just kind of maybe make the link for our listeners who might be curious about forest management and fires, and how your solution might play into that much larger and complex puzzle?
I'm glad you asked that. I do keep encountering most people say, why would you want to bring a tree down if you don't have to? Why is WholeTrees green? You're killing trees. And it all falls on the fact that none of our forests, our big forest stands, our swaths of forest, our forests that were originally planted as agriculture, those that are ecosystems, almost none of them are old growth now. They're mostly young and mid-growth forests that sprouted up again after being clear cut. When trees sprout up, they sprout up very tightly with lots of little seedlings growing very tightly together. Historically, tightly seeded young natural forests have forest fires occasionally that kill off some of the seedlings and some of the young trees, so that by the time the forest matures, you have a really well dispersed open forest that's strong and can combat wildfires. It won't catch fire as easily. But after we clear cut, we allowed forests to reseed themselves very tightly, but then we kept forest fires from happening on a regular basis because we lived near them now. And we didn't want forest fires to happen. And that made sense. It wasn't good for our societies. And so now what we have are these very tightly suppressed, overstocked, mid-growth forests that never had the chance to grow the way they needed to reach a healthy, robust, mature state. The solution to that would be to thin these forests or cull them of their small diameter trees and of their underbrush and of some of the extra stocked material that contributes to rapid fire. And in order to do that, you need to have a market for these small trees. We don't have enough money to go in and thin all these trees needed to be removed from the millions of acres of overstocked forest land. We can't just do that in a nonprofit fashion. We have to have markets that incentivize it, or it won't happen. Because it hasn't been incentivized and we don't have markets for young trees, we've been seeing a much higher level of forest fires. So there are pushes now, especially in California. California is doing a great job telling the story of and trying to incentivize new markets for young trees and low-value trees so that forests can be better managed and we can avoid the forest fires that we've been seeing increasing over the last 20 years. So WholeTrees fits into that solution as one of the new markets that small diameter and other cull trees can fit into. So by creating high value markets in commercial construction where this material has never been before in modern society, we are able to foment jobs in rural communities and incentivize the proper management of these overstocked forests.
I imagine like what we're experiencing in California as well. I'm sitting here on unceded Pomo and Miwok territory, and we're actually seeing a resurgence of leadership from indigenous tribes reclaiming the lifeways of actually catalyzing those burns for the sake of whole ecosystem health and forest health. And so, obviously, prescribed burns, indigenous-led prescribed burns are a piece of that equation, as well as what WholeTrees is bringing to the table. So, definitely appreciating the more eco-literacy around the active management of forests as kind of a historical piece that is often kind of ignored and written out of history books as these pristine wilderness areas, but they weren't. They were heavily and actively managed by indigenous people that lived here prior to European contact. So
I'm glad you bring that up. You're right. Yes, humans interact with and actively manage forests, and it's this culture, and I say our because my family came to the United States around the time when the forests were being deforested across the Midwest. And you kind of look directly from the choices made then to what's happening now to our forests. And there are some decisions that were made that we ought to learn about and educate ourselves about. Like you said, a literacy around the role forest management plays in what's happening to our natural resources. That is definitely, it's a long and tragic story at times, but there's a lot of hope to it now.
Well, thank you for being a part of that hopeful curve. I want to talk, so many of our listeners are either investors themselves or seeking investment. And we at Lift Economy facilitate a network of investors that are particularly focused and interested in what is now a buzzword, regenerative agriculture. But these investments kind of tend to be characterized by what I would call natural systems returns. So more along the lines of like a 3% return as opposed to a more extractive return. And I would love to hear your take on and any insights or knowledge you've gleaned from actually raising the funding you required for WholeTrees, and any recommendations for entrepreneurs, especially entrepreneurs working with working lands, agricultural systems, raising capital.
Yes, that's a great question. So WholeTrees has raised 2 rounds of capital to date, a common unit round of $1 million, a Series A of $1.5 million. We're just preparing a Series B of $3 million. So that's a big part of what we do is how can we use capital in a way that actually increases the returns for our investors, while at the same time maintaining mission. These are all really complicated knife edges to balance all together. And for your listeners, I would say that the big discussion of regenerative investments and impact investment really does come down to what is a healthy return for an investment. We try to envision scale for our company, which means we're going for larger sums of money. And those larger sums of money are often very much associated with higher returns that I would use the word extractive on, but most investors feel that there are ways of sustainably cultivating sustainable or regenerative businesses and still having competitive returns. I think that educating yourself about what are the returns investors are competing with when they look at your business. Where are they going to put that money that they might put in your business? Are they going to use it for philanthropy where they get no return and maybe with you they get 3%? Are they planning to put it in an account where they might get 5% and you can help them understand why 3% will meet their needs as a regenerative human in our society? Or are you talking with funds that are expecting a 10x return, which can sometimes look like a 25% return when all is said and done? And maybe don't talk to them. I've spent years talking to venture teams that felt they were green or clean tech. But when it came to suggesting they should bring their return mandates down from, say, 12% to 8%, 8% being still quite high when it comes to making money while not doing any work, I would lose their interest. So my advice is to really understand the value proposition you're asking for. How are you going to turn the dollars you're accepting into a return? And what is the alternate use of money your investor might use their money for? Where else might they put it? So that you can really talk to them about money. The WholeTrees is such an interesting and beautiful story that we often bring investors in and they get excited. And we have such a strong position in terms of ROI. But we are not pretending to be a venture firm where we'll have a 25% return someday. And we do lose interest when we are not competing. And so we've wasted our breath. So now we're good at learning which investors have the appetite for the return percentage we're offering. And we start talking about money pretty early on with them. And if we miss the boat on what they're hoping for, we move on. We waste a lot less breath by really honing in on what investors' appetites are for in turn of their return. I do think that's really important.
That is such great advice, Amelia. I am really, really appreciating the firsthand learning. And we often talk about a no from a potential investor is actually a great outcome of a meeting because it means you can save the rest of your time and go elsewhere, just really being calibrated to investor expectations and early on giving them as much information as possible so they can make a decision and save everyone's time. I'm appreciating that ethos that you've learned over time. It's very, very important.
I would love to add one thing for your listeners to that. I mean, rejection is so hard. And I do think that our persistence and tenacity as a company has had to do with wrestling with what rejection brings up in us as individuals. and separating ourselves from it. It's almost like a Buddhist concept of sorts. Rejection is a thing, and we are okay. There can be so much shame. I see it a lot in entrepreneurs because we are just, hungry for acceptance in our company and in our vision. And to separate internal validation and how our company's doing from the inevitable 100 rejections you need to get, and learning to go through a little bit of a grieving phase every time you get a no, and then get up the next day and recognize that that's normal. And it makes you stronger. Like I mentioned, we're about to launch a Series B, and I sort of gave myself a little pep talk. Okay, I'm going to put my rejection gear back on. Time to go find my 100 rejections. And maybe I had to stay in bed a little bit longer one day before getting up and doing it, because all right, here we go. Here comes 4 months of 100 rejections, because that's what's going to take to raise $3 million. And then now we're doing it. So I just want to give your entrepreneurs a pat on the back. When you feel sadness and, maybe even shame around rejections, that's normal. Give yourself some chicken noodle soup and then get up and do it again.
Yeah. Great point. Holding that equanimity. So as we come to the close of this conversation, gosh, that vision that you laid out of having other timber companies be licensing some of your ways of doing this work that you've created. I guess the question that comes up for me is, what do you need right now? How can people help you grow this vision as it relates to the next economy?
Super. 2 things. 1, bring us to building projects. Bring us to commercial building projects. Envision building projects in your community, university buildings, parking garages, libraries. Envision them as regenerative structures, and make sure that the decision makers, the committees, and the architects working on these projects know about their options. And bring WholeTrees to architecture firms that you love or are part of. We present, we teach, we sell. So getting our product to new markets, that's one. The second one is, I think, capital right now. I'd say that, we're moving into a Series B, and accessing the right kind of capital to enable a B Corp to grow towards strong returns and a strong regenerative mission. That's important to us. So those are the 2 things we need: access to the right capital and ongoing introduction to new building opportunities.
We'll keep our eyes and ears and hearts open to those connections and contacts for you and for all of us, really, for the sake of this endeavor that you are building that is so important for our forests and for our hearts and minds, the people using those buildings having very natural, visceral trees around them, reminding them of what is important. Any last thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners before we bring our conversation to a close?
I think just a gratitude that you and your listeners exist, that you're putting value into regenerative economy, because there's just this balance between internal growth and the way it plays itself out in business is, I guess that's what helps our society arc towards health and justice, is the reflection and power that comes from regenerative models. So thank you to you and to your listeners for placing your bets there.
Thank you, Amelia. Really, really looking forward to following your work and keeping tabs on how this WholeTrees grows.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.